The latte factor is, depending on who you ask, either one of the most eye-opening insights in the world of personal finance or a helpful, albeit somewhat overblown, tactic for reaching financial independence. For those who don't know, the latte factor, popularized by author David Bach, is the idea that small, regular savings can lead to the accumulation of immense fortunes over time. It's called the latte factor because that just so happened to be the example that Bach used of a relatively inexpensive item that someone may find themselves purchasing nearly every day. A purchase that, if passed on in favor of adding to your investments over an extended period of time, could lead to you growing quite a sizable chunk of wealth. And he's not wrong. If we figure that a latte, or whatever fairly inexpensive but regular purchase you might make, costs you about $5 a day, or roughly $150 a month, then opting to pass on that purchase and using that money to add to your investments could, over time, lead to you building a surprising amount of wealth. If we assumed that you put that money into a simple S&P 500 index fund, then over the course of the last 40 years, which in this case would be from 1982 through the end of 2021, as that's the most recent completed year available to me at the time of this writing, that $5 a day investment would have grown to be worth over $1.2 million. Even with the downturn we've experienced in 2022, that figure would still clock in at nearly $1 million, which is pretty incredible for a mere $5 a day investment born out of just a single habit change. The point is, seemingly small decisions, when done consistently, can build up to creating life-changing results. Therefore, it's important that, every once in a while, we take a moment to reflect on our decisions and habits that may be leading us down a path we don't want to reach the end of, so that we can get down to the business of making the changes we need in order to reach a destination we'll actually be happy with. And that's what we're going to be doing today. Let's discuss the 4 stages of habit formation and habit destruction that enable us to build those atomically sized habits and make those small decisions that enable us to get the most out of our finances and our lives. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a 30-day free trial of Audible and 2 free audiobooks of your choice, as well as a list of some books on money I'd recommend checking out with your free trial. The 4 stages of habit formation, as discussed by James Clear, author of the best-selling book Atomic Habits, are the cue, the craving, the response, and the reward. Let's talk about each of these stages individually and some tricks that can be used in each stage to make our habits stick or, if need be, disappear. The first stage of habit formation is the cue. The cue is simply the thing that triggers your brain to do something. For example, something as simple as the smell of dinner on the table could serve as the cue for you to wash your hands before you eat. To make the most out of cues, we want to ensure that they are both obvious and recognizable. There are many ways we can do this, but perhaps the easiest to implement is to tie your desired behavior to a specific time and place beforehand through the use of a technique that Clear calls the implementation intention statement. Basically, what it is you making a plan beforehand about when and where you're going to perform an action. The goal is to give yourself some clarity about what you want to achieve and what it's going to take to achieve it. For example, instead of telling yourself, I'm going to work out at least 3 times a week, which is a fairly vague statement, you will instead tell yourself that during this week, I will exercise for at least 30 minutes after leaving work on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 5:30 in the evening at my local gym. That's a much clearer plan than just saying you're going to work out a few times during the week. It ties your desired behavior to a specific time, location, situation, and action. In this case, when you are leaving work on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at around 5:30. You could even set up an alarm on your phone to serve as an additional cue. And you can take this approach a step further by linking desirable habits to each other. Clear refers to this as habit stacking in the book. For example, if, in addition to exercising 3 times a week, you wanted to learn to code, you would simply add that to your implementation intention statement. The statement would now look something along the lines of, during this week, I will exercise for at least 30 minutes after leaving work on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 5:30 in the evening at my local gym. After I finish my workout, I will return home and complete at least 1 module in my coding class. On the flip side, if there's a habit that you want to break because it isn't helping you, then you essentially need to do the opposite of what we just discussed. Instead of making the cue obvious and recognizable for what it is, you will want to make it as subtle and invisible as possible. For instance, if you're not eating as well as you might like, you could try something like stashing less healthy foods in more obscure and difficult to get to locations, such as the back of the pantry or buried behind other foods in the fridge. Or you could even go a step further and remove the unhealthy foods from your house entirely. This certainly doesn't stop you from going out and buying more of those unhealthy foods, or just eating out more, but at the very least, it does add an extra step to the process of making a decision that you don't actually want to make. And that extra step gives you one last chance to change course. The second stage of habit formation is the craving stage. I don't think I need to go into too much detail here. We all know what cravings are. They're essentially the motivation behind our actions, whether those actions involve getting something, removing something, or just changing something. Without the craving and the anticipation of the reward that satisfying the craving will bring, we have little reason to do much of anything. To get the most out of this stage of habit formation, we need to ensure that the reward we get for satisfying our cravings is as attractive as possible. Why? Well, because scientists have found that our brains release dopamine, often referred to as the feel-good hormone, when we anticipate getting a reward in the near future, not just when we actually get the reward. Take a look at this chart, for instance. It illustrates when dopamine spikes in the process of habit formation. The first graph showcases a hypothetical person's experience before a habit is first learned, and it indicates that dopamine is released when the reward is received. The second time around, though, dopamine is released pretty much right after the cue is recognized, right at the beginning of that craving stage. The brain is expecting a reward once the craving is satisfied. The third graph shows what happens when a reward that is expected during the craving stage is not actually received during the reward stage. In this case, dopamine is still released during that craving stage because of the anticipation that the reward is coming, but when the reward phase arrives and you don't actually get what you thought you would, dopamine levels drop because you're disappointed by the outcome. The fourth and final graph showcases what happens when a reward does come, but a little bit later than expected. Again, during the craving stage, the anticipation of a reward is still there, so the dopamine levels spike, but they briefly dip at the beginning of the reward phase as the person is initially disappointed, thinking that they did not actually receive the reward that they anticipated. But then, surprise, the reward came in a little later than anticipated, and dopamine levels rise again. The point is, these studies found that after a habit is initially learned, in most cases, the bulk of the dopamine spike comes in the anticipation of a reward, as opposed to the actual receiving of a reward. Therefore, if we want to get ourselves to consistently do something, we have to make that reward as attractive as possible, so that the anticipation of receiving it is as strong as possible. You can take this a step further by surrounding yourself with people who have already displayed the habits you want to form. I mean, there is a lot of truth to the idea that you are the average of the 5 or so people that you spend the most time with. Or by tying the habit that you're trying to form to something that you already want to do. Clear refers to this as temptation leveling. It essentially functions much like the habit stacking that we discussed in the previous section. What you essentially do is link the habit that you're trying to form with a habit that you already have and enjoy, and wish to keep. For instance, if you're trying to become more grateful in your day-to-day life, you could set up your morning like this. After I get my morning coffee, a habit that you already have, I will say one thing that I'm grateful for that happened yesterday. This is the habit that you're trying to form. After I say one thing I'm grateful for, I will check in on last night's games, or whatever it is that you may want to do that serves as your reward for forming the new habit. And again, if we have a habit that we want to break, we need to do the opposite. Instead of having an attractive reward that we'll be anticipating with every fiber of our being, we want to make the reward as unattractive as possible so as to head off those feelings of excitement and anticipation before they start. And we definitely want to ensure that it isn't tied to anything we already really like doing. How exactly that'll look for you will of course differ from person to person, but that's the general idea. The third stage of habit formation is the response, or the actual habit that you're trying to form. Now, there are a lot of things we can do to get the most out of this stage of habit formation, but almost all of them boil down to one idea: make things easy. It may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but it makes sense when you think about it. Your ability to form a habit is dependent on a few things. First, how motivated you are to form the habit, because forming a habit is difficult and takes a lot of effort and energy at first, and we humans have evolved to conserve energy when possible for obvious reasons. The law of least effort is a thing after all. Second, your abilities to perform the actions that a habit requires. I mean, if you want to dunk a basketball on a regulation hoop every day of the year, but you can't jump high enough to reach the net, let alone the rim, you're going to have some difficulties. And third, the friction provided by your situation and environment. If you're surrounded by people that are mocking you for the habit you're trying to form, or you're extremely overworked and just don't have much time and energy to focus on creating a new habit, or you just haven't gotten that much practice yet, then it's going to be a lot more difficult than it would be otherwise. So yes, especially when you're starting a new habit, making things as easy as possible on yourself is a crucial key to success. Don't be afraid to remove obstacles where you can and reward yourself along the way. If you're trying to get into exercise, it may sound ridiculous, but don't be afraid to start really small. I've known people who have quite literally started off with the goal of doing 1 push-up a day. They did increase that amount fairly quickly over time, of course, but they wanted to make sure that in the beginning of forming the habit to exercise, it was as easy as possible to get to a point where they could feel like they succeeded. If they felt that they could do more than their goal for the day, awesome. But the point was, if they did the push-up, they won the day. You could translate the approach to finance pretty easily by, for example, finding a way to save $1 a day, and then gradually raising that amount over time until you reach a savings rate that you're comfortable with now and in the future. Is it gonna feel a little silly and unimpactful at first? Yeah, probably. I mean, we're saving $1 here. But that's not really the point. The point is forming the habit for the long term. And over the long term, a gradually rising savings rate can be highly impactful. And if you want to break a bad habit, you guessed it, do the exact opposite. Add obstacles to your environment. Start with larger goals that seem insurmountable and do whatever else you can think of to make things difficult. The fourth and final stage of habit formation is the reward stage, or the outcome that you were hoping to achieve by practicing a habit. To make the most out of the reward stage, you want to ensure that it is instantly gratifying. Instant gratification is, oftentimes rightly, derided, especially in the personal finance community, because it can lead us down a very dark path. However, it is not inherently a bad thing. We can go down a dark path because we are getting instant gratification from things that may feel good in the short term, but are bad in the long term. But if that last part wasn't the case, for instance, if we were forming a habit that'll help us over the long term, such as saving money for retirement, then the instant gratification as a reward for practicing that good habit would be perfectly fine, desirable even, as it would signal to ourselves in the moment that our efforts are worthwhile. And thus it'll help us to ensure that we'll stick with those habits for the long term. As long as we're smart about the instant gratification style rewards we give ourselves for forming good habits, they will allow us to utilize our natural inclination to prioritize the now over the distant future to our advantage, while still allowing our long-term rewards, such as growing 401k balances, to accumulate in the background. Some examples of this would be taking more free time for yourself to pursue hobbies that you may otherwise not have had the time to partake in as a reward for saving money. As long as these hobbies are not incredibly expensive, thus negating the work that you're doing to save money, they won't be too counterproductive to your goal of saving money, but they may help to reinforce the habit-forming cycle. So that's the process of forming and breaking habits. As you can imagine, learning about and mastering these techniques can help maximize your financial progress. On the budgeting side of things, we already discussed how something as simple as skipping out on a small but regular purchase, such as a morning latte, can lead to building a pretty respectable amount of wealth over the years, assuming that you move the money that you saved into your investments. And it could require nothing more complex than choosing a different route to work in the morning. Sure, it may cost you a little more in gas if the alternative route is longer, which will cut into that savings to a degree, but in most cases it'll still be a net positive, at least in the financial sense. On the debt management side of things, the idea that in order to form a habit you want to make sure that its reward is as attractive and instantly gratifying as possible is basically the philosophy that the debt snowball was built on. The whole idea is to give yourself some quick wins by knocking out the debt with the lowest balances first. Heck, the debt tsunami could also fit in here because it helps you to pay off the debts that are causing you the most stress first. And that feeling of relief of getting out from under those stressful loans is a very great reward in and of itself. In terms of investing, there are some people who deliberately start out their investing journey conservatively, by putting the majority of their money into safe bonds and or blue chip dividend-paying stocks. For some, this can prove highly effective, because what they're essentially doing is placing their money into assets that are likely to be less volatile in the short term, at least compared to some of the alternatives, and crucially, investments that pay you a regular income just for owning them. Sure, it may not be that much income when you're first starting out, but over the first few years, these investors will see that cash flow gradually grow as they continue to invest, which serves as an excellent reward, not to mention a regular queue when the dividends are paid, to continue the habit of investing regularly. And those are just a few potential examples. There are many more out there besides. With that being said, what are some examples of financial habits that you've successfully formed in the past? What are some that you'd want to break in the future? And crucially, how do you plan to make the most out of the cue, craving, response, and reward stages of habit formation and destruction? Let me know in the comments section below. But But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. If you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.